Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at crime since 1900. This video will focus on change and a subsequent video will look at continuity. You may notice that the comments have been deactivated for this video. There's going to be some fairly controversial topics covered in this. Sadly, in the past, when I've covered controversial topics, people have weighed in and it's become a little bit messy in the comments. And frankly, I don't have time to deal with that, and there was some pretty abusive stuff going around. But that does show you the strength of feeling over some of the things that I'm going to be covering in this topic. So you should be aware of the content. We will be dealing with themes including homophobia, also drugs abuse, domestic violence, and other things that you might find you're uncomfortable with watching. If you are happy to continue though, and it is a part of the course, then watch on. Just as in the 19th century, there was tremendous social change in 20th century Britain. This would have impacts on crime and punishment. The role of government in everyday life grew, partly as a consequence of the World Wars, where the government needed to get more involved in people's everyday lives. Some things were decriminalised, as attitudes shifted away from punishing them. Other things were criminalised, as attitudes began to condemn certain behaviours. Modern police forces and changes to methods of detection and prevention also had an impact on what was considered criminal. We're going to have a look at some examples of things that have changed now. The first new definitions surrounding crime that we're going to consider are homophobic crimes. Up until 1967, homosexuality was illegal in the UK. For some people in the LGBTQ+ community, this changed with the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalised or made legal homosexuality for men over 21. Later, the law was adjusted to cover other groups too. There was opposition to this at the time, but the 1960s are often described as being part of a sexual revolution, and so the government made the change to reflect changing attitudes. We shouldn't exaggerate this though. At the time, there was probably as much opposition to this act as there was support, possibly more opposition. However, the government recognised that many changing attitudes came from young people, and so as time went on, these changes would be better and better supported, and they were typically proved right. In the 21st century, this went further. The Criminal Justice Act of 2005 allowed judges to hand down harsher sentences for crimes which are considered hate crimes. These are crimes where the motive or act was aggravated by prejudice, including homophobic and racist behaviour. Previously, this was not taken into account when sentencing. Instead, an assault, for example, would be charged like any other. But after this, sentences were more serious where the perpetrator was motivated by hatred and prejudice. Further new definitions surround race crime. After World War II and the breakup of the British Empire into the Commonwealth, Britain became more multicultural as people from Commonwealth countries came to work in Britain. The Race Relations Act of 1968 made it illegal to discriminate based on race or country of origin when providing housing, jobs and public services. Attitudes in Britain could be slow to change, and changing the law couldn't stop people being racist on its own. However, this was a new definition in the law prompted by increased immigration. In 2006, this law was extended to also make spreading racial or religious hatred a crime. Another change brought about by big changes in attitudes surrounds domestic violence. In the 19th century, shocking as it might be to us, attitudes stated that the way a man treated his wife was a private matter and not something the government should have a bearing on. Men were kept dominant and the law supported this. Attitudes shifted in the 20th century as women got the vote between 1918 and 1929 as a result of the suffrage campaigns. They continued to shift as women made prominent contributions to victory in both world wars and through the social revolutions of the 1960s, which we've touched upon already. The Domestic Violence Act of 1978 was the first big change. This gave the right for victims of domestic violence to seek injunctions to legally enforce restrictions on perpetrators of violence, for example telling them that they're not allowed to go to certain addresses or be around certain people. In 1991, it became possible to prosecute rape within marriage, which was not seen as a legal definition before, despite it happening, which, as someone who was born before that, I find incredible it was that late. But there we are. In 2014, the law criminalised coercive and controlling behaviour, where an abuser threatens or controls the actions of their partner, such as who they can see, having access to a phone or money, and other things. Despite legal moves to protect people, though, the statistics do back this up, around 2 women are killed every week by a current or former partner in England and Wales. Something else I should point out as well, that not all victims of domestic violence are women. Statistically though, most are. But these laws can help anyone who's in an abusive relationship. Shifting attitudes also shifted the law when it came to abortion, though this remains controversial to this day. Terminating a pregnancy had been considered a crime, but in the 1960s there was increasing pressure to change the law. Here are some of the reasons. One was the risks from illegal backstreet abortions that put women in danger. Similarly, trauma and danger could be suffered by women who used alcohol, poisons or other methods which I won't describe here to prompt a miscarriage. Liberalisation of attitudes in the 1960s, including the women's liberation movement, also put pressure for change. The Abortion Act of 1967 legalised terminating pregnancies where the child was sure to be born with serious disability or where two doctors independently agreed that the risk to the mother's physical or mental health was very severe. In 1968, the limit at which an abortion could be carried out was 28 weeks. This has since reduced over time with medical advances. Debate over this issue remains very fierce, and I'm sure that you've got your own views on it. We now shift our attention to social crimes. In the 17th and 18th centuries, crimes like poaching and smuggling, where local people often benefited, were rarely taken seriously, except by the authorities. In the modern era, there are arguably equivalents. Smuggling illegal drugs is taken seriously by virtually everybody because of the harm they do. However, some people were happy to dodge copyright laws. People bought or copied unlicensed DVDs, CDs and other media. With the rise of the internet, media could be illegally downloaded. Such offences are rarely reported, and so copyright laws can be very hard to enforce. In response, the entertainment industry attempts to link copyright offences to organised crime like theft, drugs and smuggling. If you've ever seen any of those copyright warnings on modern-day DVDs or streamed videos, or indeed on games, then you'll probably know about this, but it's not a new phenomenon. Check out this particular advert from probably the late 1980s here. It shows an early floppy disk and the potential of what it could cost you, a £2,000 fine or even prison time. Another area where there have been some big changes in the law is driving offences, and some of these have been down to changing attitudes, for example with drink driving. Driving while drunk has been against the law since 1925, so 100 years now when I record this. And before that there were laws against being drunk in charge of horses, so this was nothing new. In 1967, the drink drive limit defined the legal limit of how much alcohol one could have in one's bloodstream and still legally be considered safe to drive. Despite this, as recently as the 1970s, driving while drunk was very common and considered by many to be socially acceptable. This poster here is actually a parody. It's sometimes claimed to be a genuine 1970s drink driving poster, but that's not true. What it does reveal to us, though, is what people's attitudes were like at the time, as it's a parody of that. It claims that lots of people thought nothing of drinking 4 pints and then getting in their car and driving home, and that was certainly true of a lot of people at the time. Today, we understand just how unsafe that is. 50 years later, attitudes have drastically changed, and few see it as acceptable behaviour to drive drunk. Part of this is perhaps due to hard-hitting government-funded awareness campaigns, like the one that is shown here, often with shocking or jarring images. Similarly, attitudes to speeding have changed, with more government awareness adverts and the introduction of speed awareness courses as a form of punishment for breaking the speed limit. Finally, we'll consider how the law affects drugs. Most drugs that are illegal today were outlawed by the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. There are debates over the best ways to control the harm caused by drugs. Some claim that because drug taking mostly harms just the person taking the drug, that the act of taking drugs shouldn't be criminalised at all. Others point to the fact that organised crime and crime associated with drugs or intoxicated behaviour, for example theft or violence, demonstrate that drug taking is not victimless. Some want harsher punishments for dealing and possessing drugs. Others that helping people out of addiction would be easier if drugs were regulated and legalised. Our final points then. Changes in attitudes have often driven changes to the law in the 20th and 21st centuries. Some things that had been against the law in the past now no longer are, and equally some things that were legal in the past are now not legal at all. In 1967, the Sexual Offences Act began the process of decriminalising homosexuality, and from 2005, crimes motivated by prejudice, for example racism or homophobia, have been treated as hate crimes with harsher sentencing. Along a similar line, the 1968 Race Relations Act made racial discrimination illegal as a result of increased immigration. In Victorian times, domestic violence was treated as a private matter and rarely prosecuted. The 1976 Domestic Violence Act gave people powers to protect themselves from abuse. In 1991, rape in marriage became illegal, and in 2014 this was extended to include coercive and controlling crimes. Continuing social change of the 1960s, especially for women, led to the legalisation of abortion in 1967. Some crimes are still considered social crimes and rarely reported, such as copyright infringement and media piracy. However, other crimes like speeding and drink driving are widely condemned today, even though they were not so widely condemned 50 years ago. Many of these issues remain controversial to this day, and they're often very current and in the news. You'll probably have your own opinions about them, but this is the information that you'll need to know for the GCSE exam, and in that respect, I hope that this video has been useful to you. If it has, please do like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. The next video I'll publish will be all about continuity in modern crime. I'll speak to you then. Goodbye.